By this stage, I very quickly began to realize, oh my God, everybody in this country is completely and utterly exhausted. And as a student of the history of the People's Republic and as part of our studies, I learned that these types of movements had been going on, this constant bombardment of noise and information and exhortation and demands, political expressions of loyalty, had been going on since 1949. That is for 25 years non-stop. Now, American friends will appreciate this because many friends I have in America feel as this has been going on for 10 years non-stop.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover. We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My co-host Maria Repnikova will be back next week. Today, my guest is Geremie Barmé. He was the first guest on Rhyming Chaos on an episode released on February 20 this year, 2025, a mere 7 months ago. The episode was called How to Commit a Self-Coup in the US and China, What Recent Chinese History Can Teach Us About the Musk-Trump Power Grab. I'd encourage you to go listen to that episode if you haven't previously done so. The discussion has stood the test of time, and the last 7 months have been quite as grim as the other Geremie and I had anticipated. And if you haven't listened to that episode, let me quickly introduce Geremie R. Barmé to you. He is a sinologist, historian, filmmaker, translator, and author of a number of books on Chinese culture, politics, and life. He used to write Chinese language newspaper columns and essays. He started a huge China Center at Australia National University. And he still manages to be one of the most voracious readers and viewers of books, news, articles, and films about America. So on a day that Donald Trump told all of the USA's most senior military officers that there was an enemy within in the form of so-called radical left Democrats, it seems fitting to talk to Geremie again about the last 7 months, our crazy present, and what the future may hold. Welcome back to Rhyming Chaos, Geremie.
Jerry, thanks so much.
First thing I'd like to ask about is a sort of a life question about the hectic pace of events in the United States right now. I've heard you talk about being in China at the end of the Cultural Revolution, when every day would bring some new campaign or political directive or enemy to hate or thing that you had to think, a constant onslaught of mind-numbing grimness inflicted by the government on its people and by some of the people themselves on each other. And I thought of that on the weekend as I tried to compile a list of crazy stuff the Trump administration had done in the last week. And I'd started about a week previously, and it was fourth Venezuelan boat blown up with no evidence that anything sketchy was going on. Just the U.S. military just blew up a boat in international waters. There was a directive to clear up the homeless from various cities, including D.C. Clearing up meaning what? Who knows? ICE stormtroopers tear gas and assaulted protesters in Chicago. The Secretary of Defense, who now calls himself the Secretary of War, Hegseth, ordered journalists basically to make propaganda. The Bureau of Labor Statistics postponed a key inflation data report. There was a $100,000 fine or tax or fee mooted for H-1B1 visa holders. Trump continued to assault the media and TV appearances. A man caged by ICE was found dead in his cell. And on the same day, somebody else compiled a list. Trump instructed his attorney general to go after specific political enemies. His White House spoke to a shady deal that will see TikTok in the hands of a consortium of GOP mega donors, including Larry Ellison. Trump threatened bad things if the United States doesn't retake Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on. And, that's really just the notes I had from a single day about a week ago. It's an assault on one's sense of reality and one's sense of decency. And I think you've experienced something like that in China in the late 70s. Can you talk about that?
Well, before I do, I think you left out the UN speech.
Yes, well, that was later than the day I was referring to. I gave up last Saturday, basically.
I'm sorry. Well, because we're talking about America and China, it's the day that basically America handed, some global influence to the People's Republic of China in many ways. So it was astounding. Yeah, we've discussed this before. And as you said, I only went to China in the dying days of the Maoist government. I've been interested since 67, 68 as a teenager, and had begun following things sort of semi-earnestly from the late 60s, really from the Ninth Party Congress, which I later learned from my Red Guard friends that, oh yes, they opened the Congress on April the 1st. We all knew it was April Fool's Day, and that's how we felt by 1969. But when I got to China a year or two before that, I'd been following the news from China, reading the newspaper, and being educated in how to read Maoist language, because the Maoist era Chinese is a very particular creature, which sadly is the most fluent form of Chinese I know. But I arrived in China, and very quickly, within a day or two, one got used to the idea of this constant bombardment. First, there was in the morning. You got up, you were roused by, I was in school first in the Beijing Languages Institute, then in Fudan University, and then in Liaoning, up in Liaoning University in Shenyang. So over those years, you'd be woken up by a clarion call of trumpets or martial music usually at 6 o'clock in the morning, after which one was supposed to go for a run. And then while one was doing one's run, the broadcast began, the student broadcasts, outlining the latest developments in the student activities at the university in regard to the highest directive being issued from Chairman Mao and Gunanhai. 最高指示, that's called the highest directive, which is usually just a quotation from Mao, which everybody, like some sort of line in the Bible, everyone was supposed to interpret this gnomic utterance, the highest directive, as being somehow relevant to their lives, their activities, and the politics of the day. It's absurd. You finish your run, you do your calisthenics, and over breakfast, you had at 7 o'clock or so, would be blasted into the canteen, would be blasted the latest front page of the People's Daily, read out either from the central authorities or by student readers, all reading in that screamy type of Chinese that one very rarely hears anymore. Occasionally, when the commies get really excited, they'll use the old voice. But that was the voice and the tone that was popularized in 1966 during the Red Guard gatherings in Tiananmen Square. Then the papers would come, and they would have editorials or articles on what was called the latest developments in the class struggle, 阶级斗争的新动向, which would relate to the latest, whatever the campaign happened to be. I arrived in China just at the end of the campaign against Lin Biao and to criticize Confucius. And very quickly that developed into the campaign to reevaluate the Ming Dynasty with novel water margin and to denounce capitulationists. And that was followed by the campaign to study, and I'm not joking, early 75, the 33 quotations from Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Chairman Mao on bourgeois rights and reducing the differences between the pay scale of workers and peasants. So the movement's just constant. But then there was the daily assault was through, of course, the broadcast, the newspaper, but all of our Chinese classmates and Chinese later friends outside our compounds, the university compounds, were themselves being exhorted at their workplaces, in factories and in the villages and elsewhere, to carry out the class struggle according to the latest instructions issued by the People's Daily or Central Radio. And all of them, students and others, we were not allowed to participate in these. We had sort of, formal study. We had to go to class and study Mao Zedong thought in its various permutations. But normal people were expected to go to study sessions. Depending on your workplace, your activity, and your rank, the study sessions would be either a full Wednesday and Saturday afternoon, or they might be daily with readings of papers and people writing responses, or most importantly, at all of these occasions, during the morning, during the study sessions, during mass meetings. And the mass meetings were constant because they were held in all work organizations and in universities to exhort people to follow the directives and also to express the crucial thing, to 表态 or 表忠心, to express their loyalty, their fealty. And to do that, even normal people, even shop workers, you'd often go by a shop in the street, just selling this, that, and the other. People sitting there gathered around the party secretary reading the newspaper. Of course, one would always notice that most of the people gathered, there'd only be 3 or 4 people, 2 or 3 of them would be sitting there knitting. Because by this stage, I very quickly began to realize, oh my God, everybody in this country is completely and utterly exhausted. And as a student of the history of the People's Republic and as part of our studies, I learned that these types of movements had been going on this constant bombardment of noise and information and exhortation and demands, political expressions of loyalty, have been going on since 1949. That is for 25 years non-stop. Now, American friends will appreciate this because many friends I have in America feel as this has been going on for 10 years non-stop, as it has since the first.
It has, although I suppose, I mean, there is a huge difference in the sense that if you turn off the internet, you can opt out. If you just don't pay any attention to politics and you happen not to be somebody who ICE wants to target, you can just pretend nothing is going on.
Yeah, you live in a disorganized society. Maybe that will change, given the fact that you're being run by Christian nationalists who like nothing more than getting people together and having Bible study. So you never know. But yes, China was organized. As you know, China, there's all the talk about the China collectivism over the individual, the great enterprise of the Chinese nation. This is all made up and created first during the war period because people began to get organized, and the communists organized themselves in particular during the anti-Japanese war. But from 1949 onwards, the whole society was remade and turned into a collectivist society. And all organizations and schools, local households, local neighborhoods were all organized into cells. So people were easily called to study and so on. And one must remember that in the countryside, all the villages had loudspeakers throughout them. In the cities, all houses had loudspeakers in them. All trains and buses had loudspeakers in them. It was very 1984. I'd read 1984 and all those other things as a high school student. And then I really did find myself living in it. And it was sort of impossible. It took a long time to sort of realize this is as crazy as the fictional world described by Orwell sounded. But it's all true. It's actually, I'm living in a place where all this is happening. And I, being a young, very sort of left-leaning and very optimistic 20-year-old, when I went to China, I was thinking that, well, one must understand what's happening. One shouldn't be critical. One must, understand China. One must move more than halfway to appreciate what's really happening. So I was very open to it all and took it very seriously for the first year and a half or so, but gradually it all fell to pieces. In particular, on the day of April the 5th, 1976, when there was that major public display of rebellion against Mao and the so-called Gang of Four, what would be called the Gang of Four, in Tiananmen Square following Zhou Enlai's death, when tens of thousands of people protested against the dictatorship, the proletarian dictatorship. And my Chinese roommate took me aside that night and said, I think I need to tell you something. Then my rather romantic revolutionary ideas all began to just crumble.
Yes, well, maybe one Charlie Kirk acolyte will have that experience in America in a few years' time. Can we talk about some other kind of similarities of the Mao era and the current United States? I think in our previous discussions, one of the things you talked about was the Yentang, the idea of the monologue hall. Can you talk about that?
So this term was popularized, of all people, by Deng Xiaoping himself in the late 1970s, when the party began to overturn elements of the Cultural Revolution. Although one should point out, the party denounced the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution, 66 to 76. It denounced this 10-year period and said it was a vacuum, a wasted 10 years. But when they came out with their formal critique of the Cultural Revolution, they made it quite clear that, in fact, the country had gone through 20 years of errant politics. They tried to avoid speaking in those terms because they wanted to reaffirm the importance of Liu Shaoqi and the others in the early 60s, and by extension, reaffirm the importance of Deng Xiaoping himself. Anyway, Deng was the one who said one of the disasters that occurred during that 20-year period from the Great Leap until the end of the Cultural Revolution was the fact that because of his incredible prestige and influence, Chairman Mao's voice became the only voice. His ideas became the only ideas. His prestige was so great that we all followed him, which is true. They all did. They all voted for all of the movements, all of the purges. They voted for their own destruction. Very Arthur Koestler, Darkness at Moon. And he said,
never mind that, very reminiscent of that bunch of tech moguls sitting around the table praising the emperor.
Indeed, and Deng Xiaoping used the expression, we have this Yentang, the hall of the one voice, the monologue hall, where only one leader, one party official, one party secretary in a unit, one provincial leader, and one central leader will have a say over everything. And he said this kind of anti-democratic, this is communist democratic, anti-democratic behavior has destroyed collective deliberation. It has destroyed our ability to actually formulate policy collectively and rationally. And we must embrace what he called 群言堂, a hall of many voices. And this relates to Chinese tradition because in the tradition, one of the great concerns about any bureaucrat or person, even from the pre-imperial era, from the pre-Qin era, is the question of how you deal with yan lu. Yan, words, lu, way, path. How you deal with opposition or multiple voices, how you deal with different ideas. And it's been a source of debate and discussion, like in every other society in China, literally for 2,500 years. As we see today, China still hasn't resolved that issue. And we see with America, Mr. Trump and his fellows have a very definite view about the issue, and they'd like to resolve it in a way that goes completely against the whole history of the American Revolution.
Another thing we've talked about is the culture of snitching that was prevalent in Mao era China and how it seems to be rising in the US right now.
Well, indeed. Well, your Vice President, J.D. Vance, called on people in companies to snitch on their colleagues and friends if they had been critical of Charlie Kirk or not sufficiently mournful of his death, which I thought was fantastic. Here, I would note that I was disgusted to see that the Australian representative in Washington, one Kevin Rudd, who we all know, an old, very, very old friend of mine, he formally published an announcement saying the Australian government and people were also mourning the death of Charlie Kirk. Dare say this is because Australia is hoping for our Prime Minister, Mr. Albanese, to meet with Trump and get some sweetheart deal regarding tariffs. But it's the culture of snitching. So the People's Republic literally instituted a culture of what's called 检举, 告密, 打小报告, you name it. There's Chinese has a very rich vocabulary for how to tell tales about your neighbors, friends, colleagues, and classmates. It instituted it through the movement, the thought reform and suppression of counter-revolutionaries in 1950, 51, 52. As it was organizing itself into cells, these collectives that the party favored for ruling over people, it also instituted a culture of constantly reporting on oneself, admitting one's errors in collective study sessions, but also reporting on one's classmates and so on and so forth. It also established a vast system of dossiers, personnel files that covered all people living in cities and a lot of people even in the countryside. Dossiers that would have the details of your birth, of course, your name, your class, background, and status, and then details of how you had participated in the various political movements that were carried out from 1940, 50, 51 onwards. And within that would also be the depositions, the 检举 or the 报告 that anybody could report on anybody. And that material would be entered into your file without you even knowing it. And it would be used by the local authorities, your party secretary, the local street committee, the local old ladies who ran your lives in your community. They could, or your student mentors or whatever, high school class monitors, they would use it secretly to evaluate your behavior in the next movement. So there's this constant reporting. Of course, everyone's very familiar with the idea that children are reporting on parents, and they all regard this as being a cultural revolution activity, as it was, the young reporting on the old, the young rebelling against the old. But again, many people who deal with China, who are not that familiar with the history of the People's Republic, think that that was all just the cultural revolution. This whole practice, this cultural practice of recrimination, reporting, betrayal, deception, and the creation of dossiers, as I said, began 17 years before the Cultural Revolution, and it continued in full force, really, until the 1990s.
And in America now, we're going to have a digital version of that, thanks to people like Larry Ellison, Trump's crony.
I would imagine, taking up from where we left off last time, this is exactly what Doge is doing.
Yeah, I think Doge is doing. And Larry Ellison actually said that last September at a meeting, financial analyst meeting, he said artificial intelligence will help process vast amounts of footage recorded by cameras everywhere. And he said, citizens, I quote, will be on their best behavior because we are constantly recording and reporting everything that's going on.
It was lovely to see that because it echoes with the great Chinese that if you haven't done anything wrong, what are you worried about? The
Right.
classic, one thinks of America will finally move into the realm of that old Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're getting there. The only thing that Foucault wrote that I think actually stands the test of time is the ideas about the
Except he took
panopticon.
the idea from someone else,
That's true, right? It was an 18th century person.
Jeremy Bentham.
That's right, Bentham.
But I would point out, I mean, we're talking about the China-American comparisons, of which, as you know, since 2017, when I first wrote an essay comparing Mao and Trump, because of their personal idiosyncrasies and because of the nature of how dictatorial, authoritarian, narcissistic political figures tend to act. Beyond that, though, is that America is going through, and many commentators have remarked that this is a classic authoritarian handbook. Timothy Snyder's talked about it. Stacey Abrams has been very good on this subject. Jason Stanley. They've all described what America's going through. And Applebaum extremely clearly. It's not that America does not lack clear-eyed analysts and people who really are standing up and speaking out and warning of what all of this means. In China, those types of people were wiped out in the early 50s. Though I would point out, just by the by, I would point out, just as I got to China, I didn't know this until about 2 years after I'd been in China, a young group of former Red Guards wrote a critique of the Maoist regime in Canton, 1974, and they stuck it up on huge pieces of paper. It's a Dao Zibao, a big character poster, dozens of pages. It was massively long. And it was a critique of what they called the fascist regime of the Lin Biao order. And that poster became very famous for a short time. It was a thorough, complete critique of a sort of what they call the fascist dictatorship of Lin Biao. And they tried to avoid mentioning Mao too much, but they were actually talking about Mao. The poster went up, was circulated around the country. Many people were jailed for it. And just interesting for your amusement is that that group of people, they were all jailed. And it was called the Li Yizhe Dazabao because its authors were Li Zhengtian, Shen Yizhi, and Wang Xizhe, and took a character from each name to create Li Yizhe, the Li Yizhe poster. And they were all jailed. And it was interestingly enough, it was Xi Zhongxun, Xi Jinping's father, who rehabilitated them and brought them back into favor.
Wow, interesting.
And what they're saying in their poster is about would be a critique that they would make exactly of Xi Jinping 40, 50 years later.
Or perhaps of J.D. Vance. Now, talk about the Dazabao, the big character posters. To go back to the topic of snitching, I mean, they were used for, counter-establishment, anti-establishment speech. And of course, they also used the Cultural Revolution to denounce people. And Twitter seems to be very similar in some ways. It has been an instrument of sort of free speech for liberal voices, but it's also a place where you can snitch on people and condemn them, like the crackpot social media personality and government influencer Lara Loomer has been tweeting about people that she wants fired, and then they get fired from the government, which is rather reminiscent of the way, a big character poster could cause a political movement in China at the time, I think, right?
Well, in the big character poster, it first appeared in the 1940s when they were put up during the Yan'an rectification period in Yan'an, as the party was remolding the thinking of all of the young party members and patriots and activists who went to Yan'an as part of the opposition to the Japanese during the war period. And they had to all be sort of reordered and re-educated to become loyalists to the Mao cause. And that's when Mao Zedong thought was created. Big character posters, they were quite small then. They were large sheets of paper on which people wrote in calligraphic hand, would write up criticisms or comments on life in Yan'an and things that were going wrong in the party and so on and so forth. That led to a purge of most of the people who wrote those types of posters. They reappeared as a form of public expression and opposition in 1956-57 during the 100 Flowers movement. And Mao encouraged them. He said, we need to have the the people speaking out people expressing themselves, never clear what was different between the two, big character posters, and major public debates. These are very good. We need Siddha. And these are called the basis of mass democracy in China. Well, that was all well and good in mid-1956 to late 56 until workers in various factories in Shanghai, Wuhan, and elsewhere also put up big character posters revealing the corruption of the party and the dictatorial behavior of the party committees. They were all closed down. The workers were all jailed, and the whole movement of the 100 Flowers was crushed. Most people think it was crushed because intellectuals had spoken out. No, it was crushed because the workers had expressed rebellious tendencies, and Mao was terrified, very worried, that China would experience the same type of rebelliousness that Hungary had just experienced. One must remember that the Chinese are always looking at Eastern Europe to see what's going on there.
And that was the incident when the Soviet Union sent in tanks to...
Well, it eventually did after there was a rebellion in Hungary where basically people rebelled against the Soviet overlords. And this led to a massive rebellion. And the Soviets then sent in the tanks to crush it. And Chairman Mao was following those developments. That's one of the reasons that he launched the 100 Flowers movement. Anyway, the Cultural Revolution, when the Cultural Revolution came, he thought he would use a movement that would actually encourage Red Guards and younger people to use Deng Xiaoping and other forms to attack the status quo as part of Mao's own attempt to turn the country on its head, to destroy what we would nowadays call the deep state. So, yes, Red Guards used the Deng Xiaoping, and we're not talking, people just think what a person would put up a sheet of paper on a wall with a few criticisms. They'd go hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sheets of paper, one on top of the other, would be put up in Peking University, outside residences, in apartment buildings. Even when I went there, the place was often covered in Deng Xiaoping, people denouncing things or attacking people according to the latest political movement. By 74, 5, 6, you're putting up Deng Xiaoping that were in keeping with the official line. In 66, 67, the Deng Xiaoping was an incredibly effective vehicle for destroying the reputation of professors, engineers, economists, factory heads, local government officials. And Mao encouraged that as a way of letting people speak up and express their opinions. And he would pick out exemplary ideas from the Deng Xiaoping that were reported to him and encourage them and make them policy. One should remember that the Red Guards themselves, they were founded on the basis of 3 Deng Xiaoping that were sent to Chairman Mao in written form, written in letter form. And Mao read these and thought, this is a great idea. Let's encourage these young people. They call themselves Red Guards. That's what we'll call them. He was responding to a movement from beneath, young people calling themselves Red Guards to rebel. Laura Loomer is a similar figure. She comes up with ideas and has this type of influence. And it's encouraging, as you know, after Charlie Kirk, there are now all these other younger people vying to be influencers, to be the new right-wing influencers who are, these paleo-Christian fanatics.
Right.
You'll see many more. In the Cultural Revolution, it was the Lei Feng type figures, the loyal. Well, Lei Feng described himself as I am like a bolt in the machinery of the state. And when I was a student, everybody was aspiring to be what was called 螺丝钉精神. You have to have the spirit of being a bolt. That is, that you must be nameless, invisible, but you must function within the mechanism of the state.
Right. And this being America, I don't think that metaphor will appeal to the young Republicans. I mean, I think they prefer the debate me, bro aesthetic.
They'll have to conform to certain guidelines because, after all, they're waiting for the delayed rapture now.
Yes. One of the other crazy things that happened last week, I had no idea there was supposed to be a rapture last week, but anyway. Geremie, can we talk about the contempt for expertise, for academics, for medical expertise, or even, after today's performance, military expertise that is, a very, very clear hallmark of 7-8 months of Trump rule and obviously has parallels in Mao era China?
Indeed, again, the story is complex, but also interesting. In part, it relates to the Communist Party's war-era attempts to try and get by with whatever they could, regardless of the economic, political, or military circumstances. So there's this can-do. It's called 共和. It's well known as the spirit of 共和, cooperation, getting by, getting things done. And that it overlaps with Mao's own personal view that he, an autodidact, that he had learned how to carry out revolution with Soviet Marxist ideas in a way that went against all the formal guidelines and dogmas of the Soviet Union itself, his attitude towards peasant rebellion, so on and so forth. So there's an underlying element in the Maoist experience from the 1940s that we can do it differently, we can make it up as we go, and we don't quite trust all the established educational, cultural, legal, and other figures who dominate so-called formal society. After 1949, China begins to build a new country, and it requires all the expertise and talents of all the educated people from the past, the engineers, the lawyers, the educators, the rural leaders, and so on and so forth. So for a period, it's trying to work out, the Chinese communists are trying to work how to combine the expertise and talent of actual people who really do things and make a society function, in collaboration with the Soviet Union that sent thousands of technical experts to help the communists establish a new government and new urban centers and so on and so forth. But throughout that period, Mao and his colleagues felt that too much reliance on the expertise of people either from the past, the KMT nationalist regime in the past, or too much influence by the Soviet Union would undermine the revolutionary spirit of the Chinese Communist Party itself. So they'd expressed it very simply. They said that there are two different approaches. One is the red and one is the expert. We need to have experts who are led by political loyalty and fidelity. They must be red. They must be red and expert. And this is a debate and a formulation that developed in the 1950s. In the Cultural Revolution, Mao and his colleagues quite clearly said that we still are relying too much on the expertise of all these people in the legal sphere, in the media, in education, so on and so forth. And their activities are polluting the younger generations and society as a whole. Their expertise, not red enough, still very much linked to the bourgeois past or the reactionary ideas of the past, or now the Soviet revisionists. We distrust them, so we need to reform them. And so the Cultural Revolution, in part, as we've said in the first podcast, was an attack on the deep state, the state created during the 17 years of the People's Republic, to be replaced by a revolutionary cohort of people who'd be more politically aware and who could use their expertise to transform the country. And so when the Cultural Revolution is launched, Mao encourages young people to denounce what are called reactionary bourgeois authorities. And that is men and women in every area of social expertise, whether it's the people who run the sewage system, or the people who build the roads, or the people who are teaching you at university, or the people who are being trained to build bridges and engineers, or the people in the media or the arts. They are all bourgeois reactionary experts. Darzabao, big character posters are put up outside their apartments or in their workplaces. They are denounced because Chairman Mao says we have to overturn what we call the deep state, he called the superstructure, and create a more revolutionary society. For if we don't, these experts and all of their ideas and values will inevitably overturn the revolution itself.
So this is what's going on here right now too, really, isn't it? I mean, the attacks on the universities, the attacks on the healthcare system, the attacks even on military expertise. This is of a piece. It's the destruction of the deep state. It's perceiving the need for ideological and political correctness to be the absolute most important thing, and everything else can go by the wayside.
And one's reminded very much of the master, you must trust the people. 要相信群众. The people, and Mao put it again in the late 50s, he put it brilliantly, he said, the circle, the lowliest are the wisest. The pure elites are most stupid.
Right. Or as Chairman Trump put it, I love the uneducated.
I love the uneducated, exactly. It's incredibly resonant. It's called 被见者最聪明,高贵者最愚蠢, was Chairman Mao's famous line. It was stuck up everywhere when I was a student. And I was going to a university. It was full of experts. And all my expert teachers, you can imagine, the ones in Shanghai were all, you could tell from their faces, they had been through hell. I had one teacher, Wu Huanzhang, wonderful, lovely man, Lu Xun expert, and his eyes were always very teary because, roomy, but he looked like he was constantly on the verge of crying, and he was completely sort of riven by nervousness and terror, and it's so obvious that he really had a hard time. And he was part of a writing group that supported the Gang of Four. But in Shenyang, the teachers were far more confident and both hardline, but I did have one teacher who was very aberrant, and he had worked out exactly how to play the system. But yes, I love the uneducated or the stupid. Here one would point out that the Project 2025, if one reads it, there's actually, I'd recommend to your listeners, there's a thing called the Project 2025 tracker that you can read, and you can see exactly how much of that project has been already put in place. I think it's about 65% of the aims of that project have now been realized and now have to be consolidated and institutionalized in the long term. There's a number of these great websites that follow exactly what the Trump administration wants to do and what it's doing. As you know, Russell Vought, who's the man in charge of the budget in the White House, who is the main author really of, or the main ideologue behind Project 2025, he is hoping that the budgetary discussions at the moment will lead to the closing down of the government so that he can then fire tens of thousands. His aim is to reduce the state, to radically reduce the state. His colleague Stephen Miller's aim is to get rid of at least 100 million people from America, to repatriate them or purge them and reduce the size of America. If you look at the Project 2025 and you look at the aims of what they're doing, they want to take America radically back into some sort of more simple, idyllic, and completely illusionary Christian past. And they want to transform the nation entirely. It will be impossible. It is impossible, but the devastation on the way is going to be astounding. And the attack on expertise and competence, that is people who have objectively different views and independent minds and training in dealing with areas of expertise have to be undermined and denounced. It's exactly what the communists did in the 50s and 60s in China. It's exactly what Xi Jinping and his colleagues believe they have resolved, finally, in China, that they have resolved the contradiction between being read and being expert.
Right. And it only took them 70 years or so.
It took 70 years. And of course, it's not been resolved.
No, of course it hasn't. Yeah. If you go to Chongqing on a high-speed train and, have a dinner with an influencer, it looks like it's been resolved. But if you go underneath the surface.
Just recently, we've seen some of the late leaders in Chinese AI beginning to express rather utopic, romantic, and also highly imaginative views of where AI could go. And their ideas, if you look at that conference in Hangzhou that was held recently, the ideas are beginning to be borderline heterodox, moving in the direction of independent thought. Now, that is just not on.
There's going to be some trouble ahead for that.
The human people.
Yeah. So let's talk about seething anger and violence. Why, despite, victory over everything in America, the Trumpists are so angry, and how that might relate to things you've seen in China.
Again, many people think of this sort of line that you get from China about the century of humiliation. That is from 1840 to 1949, the period from the First Opium War right through to the establishment of the People's Republic of China. They think that this line about the century of humiliation is a very old one. It was invented in the early 1990s. I remember it well as part of the patriotic education campaign established following the crushing of the demonstrations in 1989, when the government felt that young people had become too independent-minded and workers were also becoming rebellious because of wage differentials and because of inflation, and that they had to be brought into line. And the way they dealt with it was to carry out a patriotic education campaign. It was not only propaganda, new films, and we saw this recent film about the Nanking photo studio. That's part of the propaganda campaign that began in 92, but also through the induction of students. As soon as they got to university, they'd have to go through an army boot camp and begin to learn how to mouth all the correct slogans and pass political examinations. Despite the century of humiliation and despite the fact that China became independent in 1949, and despite the propaganda move and the patriotic education campaign, the government constantly has never stopped blaming the West, blaming others, blaming anybody but itself for whatever troubles China has had. So ever since the Second World War, the Chinese communists have been stoking resentment, hate, and fury. And the Chinese language, if you read official Chinese discourse and the official editorials that are usually published at moments of major commemoration, they're full of what do you call hate speech or vitriol or extremism. This year, they're a bit more mild. It was interesting. Xi Jinping played the peace card this year. But usually, this kind of highly militarized, highly aggravated language is quite common. It's also part and parcel of a society that has just learned to hate itself, just as America is learning to hate itself. It hates itself because it always has enemies to attack and to purge. And as a result, you never know who the enemies really are. Psychologists and analysts will work out exactly what weird psychology is at work. But it's true that despite the Republicans now being in control of all arms of government and having this incredible influence over the economy and all other aspects of society, they are still angry. They're furious. They're resentful. And what does that do? You tell me you're an American. Oh, you're in America, rather.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the problems is that there is still a feeling in the Republican Party, and particularly amongst Trumpists, that the cultural and intellectual establishment doesn't respect them, which is true.
Hates them.
I mean, I think that's why the Jimmy Kimmel thing. A friend of mine said to me that the red line for him and his family to leave America under the Trump regime is if South Park gets taken off the air. And I mean, when the Jimmy Kimmel attempted ban happened, I said to him, well, how different is this? I mean, Jimmy Kimmel's a lot milder than South Park. But it also occurred to me that Trump doesn't watch cartoons, and the talk shows are part of the sort of liberal establishment in a way that even The Simpsons and South Park aren't. They're a kind of, traditional establishment, intellectual, cultural product. And that's what got his goat about Jimmy Kimmel. And that class of people is slowly starting to bend the knee, but it doesn't seem to be relieving the anger.
No, it's interesting. But regarding the late night shows in America, one should also remember that Trump was also invited onto them.
Yes, of course. Of course.
I mean, after all, his cultural view of things is still very much 1980s kitsch. Upper East Side. It's so retro. When you see his programming for the Kennedy Center in Washington, it's quite obvious that his tastes will lead very much back to that era. Back to China, though, one of the things that I've always thought is that the Chinese people, we're just talking collectively in terms of the zeitgeist and the masses, the government basically has constantly encouraged a sense of a grievance. William Callahan, the British scholars, have been written beautifully on this subject over many, many years. He wrote a great book called The Pest Optimist Nation. But this constant sense of grievance, and no matter what you get, how far you go, how modern you become, you still resent the rest of the world because you're not loved enough.
Yeah.
You're not loved enough. You can never be respected enough. And they go on. Every single move is always celebrated. Every little achievement, every victory, everything, no matter how well they are doing. And they're doing pretty well. They're still resentful. And there's still this deep underlying political, and I dare say military, I haven't dealt with military people for some years now, desire for revenge. I've always thought, to put it very crudely, when I lived in Japan, I thought, the mainland Chinese will only be happy when they get to bomb Tokyo.
Well, I mean, perhaps the self-destruction of America will do the trick. I mean,
it might not be enough. It might not be enough. The world spirit of revenge and grievance in humanity, the dark side of humanity, not just Chinese people, but we as human beings are limitless. I think things are very, very dark at the moment.
Yes, they certainly are. The wellsprings of revenge in the United States are deep.
And America's just achieved everything. It's been the world power for decades. It's still the most prosperous, strongest economy. An army that has been the model of the world, the strongest armed military ever built. Although they've hardly won any wars for many decades, nonetheless, I mean, an astounding machine, an incredible organization. And yet there you have the Minister of War, the Reich Minister of War, getting up saying, we lack a militant spirit. We need to be fighters. We need to win wars. What's he talking about? Completely absurd. And this is another thing that's very Maoist, is the complete disconnect between rhetoric and reality. Remember when Deng Xiaoping gets back into power, he revives a Yan'an-era slogan to seek truth from facts.
Right.
Because the whole Maoist regime from 1956-57 onwards, except for a little break in 61, 2, and 3, when they're recovering from the mass murder of the Great Leap Forward, the 30 to 50 million people starved to death, he called and he realized that we need to somehow get the correlation between reality and our policies, ideas and words and actions somehow correlated again because they have nothing to do with each other. And China was in a complete state of absolute, I lived through it. I saw it day by day, complete discombobulation where people's normal lives, people's reality had nothing to do with what they said, what they were forced to do, or what they pretended to think. It was extraordinary and unforgettable. And having lived through the period when all of that collapsed, all of the imagery, the imagination, the complete nothingness collapsed was quite something. And then again, from the 1990s, to see it be rebuilt, to see China begin to rebuild this culture of dishonesty and lies and fantasy regarding the war, regarding grievance, regarding social realities, pretending certain things weren't happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's going on here too now and is related to conspiracy theories, but just this inability of the populace and people in the government to distinguish fact from fiction or rumor or AI slop from reality. It seems to be bad and getting worse. And I notice in conversations I have in Nashville, Tennessee, where I live, with people that I know from the supermarket or the kids' school or something, that there are a lot of people here who seem to have a tenuous grasp on reality.
Jeremy, you live in the culture that produced Hollywood, the TV series, the whole fictional world that we here on the other end of the world, we also live in because of America. What the Australian writer, one of my favorite writers, Patrick Malber, calls the green zone in our minds.
The green zone in our minds, the American zone in everybody's brain, in the whole world. Yeah.
After all, it has been the most successful form of mass delusion and propaganda in human history. And it's also often extremely appealing.
Well, and now it's different, though, because it's so splintered because of the internet and everybody is in their own little information silo. I mean, certainly there are some on the left or the liberal side of politics in the United States who suffer from that. But I think the real problem is on the right, where people, what they think is going on is a complete fantasy. It's just outrageous.
No, indeed. And you mentioned conspiracy, the whole Chinese experience of the war onwards. See, the communists lied through the war, the Second World War. Most Chinese people believe that the Chinese Communist Party led China to victory in the Second World War. And from then on, the basic party line about international reality and Chinese reality has been at odds with the actual rhetoric that the government has promoted. That's why I've so often, over my many decades, have written about what I now call the empire of lies, and why I'm such a fan of the great independent historians who flourished in the 1980s and for a while in the 90s and on and off a bit more recent. All of them have been shut down. And the Communist Party has just woven this incredible skein of distortions and fabrications about every aspect of Chinese society, history, and reality. Meanwhile, you have a society that's incredibly together, hypermodern, successful, glitzy, and impressive. So the disconnect is fantastic. If you read Chinese official propaganda and writings and you actually live in China, it's often very hard to square the two at all. In America, though, the way things seem to be going is that the Trump administration may turn the conspiracies and madness into a reality just by the constant bombardment and the splintering and destruction of the society that they've unleashed, because they are literally destroying the American society, or trying to anyway. Again, read Project 2025, follow Russell, vote, look at what Stephen Miller wants, look at what the other regime thinkers are talking about. It's terrifying.
And the people, outside of the regime, I guess maybe he qualifies as a regime thinker, Peter Thiel, who's just given a series of lectures on the Antichrist.
Peter Thiel's lectures on the Antichrist. Did you see that I think we discussed when he lectured in Innsbruck in Austria, he gave a 4-hour lecture to leading theologian at Innsbruck, and they came out of the lectures and said, noch genug, insufficient to be qualified as something to be examined, even if he were a student. I think I used that my favorite academic expression. Peter Thiel's views on the Antichrist are not even wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, that sort of applies to most of the tech bros who take up philosophizing or theorizing. They've read one Greek book and The Art of War, and then they start writing.
This is a horrible betrayal of my sort of intellectual métier, but China has just as many. if not more, crazies like that I have met over the decades. And for all of my criticism of the Xi Jinping regime, I must say he's kept them under his thumb and controlled. What will be interesting for those of you who live beyond him, I don't know if I will, but beyond his regime, is that these types of characters and crazies, many of them in the army and elsewhere, may well come to flourish.
Yes, yes. And
you heard it here first.
Right. They may in China, and in America, of course, they're flourishing at the same time as the great leader. So we have a whole different kettle of fish. What else do you think we should be thinking about in terms of not lessons, but parallels in 20th century Chinese or 21st century Chinese history that seem somehow to be rhyming with contemporary America?
Well, I mentioned the other day, and because of this meeting that's happening today with the Department of War, this Minister Department of War, is that what it's called in the States, is that I am reminded of, again, people too often tend to see the Cultural Revolution merely as that 1966-67 period of rebel Red Guard uprising, the violence, the destruction of the state, and so on and so forth. They don't realize, and I think maybe the Red Guards were then sent off to the countryside, but it's in 68, 69 that Lin Biao, who's the head of the army, the man who Mao relied on to actually launch the Cultural Revolution, the man who created the Little Red Book, the man who used the Leifeng model, the Bolt spirit, who then began to really carry out, I mentioned there's this Li Zhe, big character poster critics called, carried out a fascist dictatorship. He basically turned the whole country into a militarized camp, gave great power to the military. The military was the only aspect of Chinese society that actually weathered the Cultural Revolution and continued to be relatively well organized, well funded, well fed, and influential and very powerful. And basically, China was under a kind of military dictatorship from 1968 until Lin Biao himself disappeared in mysterious circumstances in September 1971. So in America, we already see the deployment of troops, National Guard and troops. Well, first in an attempt in New York, in LA, at the moment in Portland, in Oregon, attempts in Chicago, this militarization of society, and basically moving in the direction of a kind of militarized nation. That is something that one really remembers from the Cultural Revolution era, the strength and control of the military. The only thing that actually was left standing, the only thing that was actually functioned. And of course, the irony of that was that it was the military that carried out, and we discussed this in our first podcast, it was the military that carried out a coup against the Gang of Four after Mao's death, the Huairentang coup of October the 10th, 1976, that ended the whole fiasco of the Cultural Revolution. So the military is an incredibly important part of all of this, and it looks like America is lurching more and more into the arms of military rule. I just pay attention to that.
Well, great. You've cheered me up. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn, and Maria Repnikova. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed also by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. Jeremy, thank you very much. We could have talked for another few hours, I think, but let's not burden the listener with a Joe Rogan length show. Thank you very much. That was enlightening.
Great pleasure.
Actually, it was not enlightening. It was engrimifying and darkening.
Well, from somebody who's been involved with both societies for nearly their whole lives, I must say, it's absolutely heartbreaking and horrifying.